I had been holding the folded flag close to my chest for what felt like hours, its crisp, tight hospital corner folds pressing hard against my palms. My husband, Colonel Daniel Harper, retired United States Army, had been buried less than 2 hours prior. The cemetery at Arlington had been quiet, save for the biting autumn wind moving through the ancient oaks and the soft, rhythmic shuffle of dress shoes on the damp grass. He had been laid to rest with more dignity than most people get in a lifetime. The honor guard had folded the flag so carefully, with that slow, silent military precision that makes the cloth look like something sacred. When the young soldier had handed it to me, his hands were trembling slightly, his voice cracking just enough for me to notice as he whispered, "On behalf of a grateful nation." I had only nodded, because that was all I could manage without breaking. Daniel would have hated a scene. He was a man who cleaned his coffee mug before bed, shined his leather shoes even after retirement, and firmly believed you could tell a person's true character by how they treated waitresses, mechanics, and janitors. So when Eleanor Harper, my mother-in-law, stepped beside me near the idling black Lincoln funeral car, wearing her heavy pearls and not a single tear on her face, I didn't turn away. She stared at the folded flag in my arms not with reverence, but like she was looking at a store receipt. "Margaret," she said softly, her tone carrying that familiar, sharp edge of authority she always used when she wanted to dominate a room. "We need to be practical now." I honestly thought she meant casseroles, incoming utility bills, or perhaps finding extra hotel rooms for the family members who had driven down from Richmond. Then, she leaned closer, her perfume choking out the clean scent of the autumn air. "That house belongs to my family now. So does the business." Daniel would have wanted his bloodline protected. I remember staring at a loose button on her navy wool coat, watching one tiny blue thread hang and swing in the wind, completely unable to process the cruelty of her timing. Behind us, Daniel's old army friend stood talking in low, respectful voices, and my sister Ruth was busy helping someone load the funeral flowers into the back of a car. Nobody heard Eleanor's words but me. I could have screamed. I could have reminded her right there on the cemetery gravel that I was Daniel's wife of 21 years, not a temporary guest in his life. I could have told her that the house in Fairfax had my name on memories she had never bothered to make. Instead, I adjusted my grip on the sacred flag, looked her straight in the eyes, and said, "Not today, Eleanor." She only smiled, a cold, satisfied expression that made it clear she took my quietness as a sign of weakness. That evening back home, the silence in the house was suffocating. Daniel's reading glasses were still sitting right beside his leather recliner, and his half-finished crossword puzzle lay on the kitchen table next to a cold cup of coffee I still couldn't bring myself to pour down the sink. At exactly 7:15 p.m., my attorney and close friend, Michael Ross, came by carrying a thick leather folder, a deep worry line etched into his forehead. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, letting out a heavy sigh. "Margaret," he said carefully, "Eleanor has already contacted the probate council." I let out a dry, hollow laugh. Of course she had. She hadn't even let the dirt settle on her own son's grave before calling her lawyers. Michael opened the folder, pointing to the preliminary filings. "You have every right to fight this, Margaret. The house, the estate accounts, Harper Precision. None of this is simple, but you are far from powerless." I looked over at Daniel's empty chair, feeling the weight of the last 2 decades we had spent building this life together. Then, I said the words that made Michael stop mid-sentence and blink twice in sheer disbelief. "Let her have it." Michael didn't say another word for several seconds. He simply sat there, staring across my kitchen table, waiting for me to take it back or tell him it was a dark joke. When I didn't, he leaned back in his chair and rubbed his forehead. "Margaret, grief makes people do strange things. If you need more time to process, we can put everything on hold." "I've already made my decision, Michael," I replied. "So you want to surrender everything?" he asked, his eyebrows lifting slightly. "I didn't say surrender," I said, looking toward the family room where Daniel's favorite leather recliner still faced the television, the local news flashing on mute. "I'm just saying I don't want to fight the way Eleanor wants me to fight." Michael slowly closed his leather folder, his expression grave. I've handled probate cases in Northern Virginia for 24 years, Margaret. I've never seen someone this calm after losing a husband and facing an immediate family lawsuit. I don't feel calm, Michael, I confessed. That was the absolute truth. The moment his car pulled out of the driveway, I walked into Daniel's closet, pressed one of his old army jackets against my face, and cried until my knees physically hurt from kneeling on the hard oak floorboards. There was nothing strategic, brave, or dignified about those tears. I was just a woman who desperately missed her husband. The following Sunday, I walked into the First Baptist Church of Fairfax by myself for the first time in over 20 years. Normally, Daniel would have insisted we arrive 15 minutes early, grumbling his favorite phrase, "Running late is disrespectful," while tossing me his truck keys. That morning, I parked the car alone in the quiet lot. People at church meant well, but their sympathy didn't make the walk inside any easier. Mrs. Collins hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe, whispering that she was praying for me every single day. Then came the inevitable whispers. I could hear them buzzing in the hallways between the pews. I heard Eleanor already hired a high-priced lawyer. Is it true she's taking the manufacturing company? Is Margaret really just letting her have the house? Small-town gossip always traveled with terrifying speed. I kept a polite smile on my face and kept walking. After the service, Frank Donovan caught up with me near the exit. Frank was Daniel's oldest Army friend, having served with him for nearly 18 years. He was built like an old oak tree, stood over 6 feet tall, and still wore his veteran baseball cap everywhere he went. He crossed his massive arms and looked down at me. "Margaret, are you going to tell me what the hell is going on?" Dan would have fought this tooth and nail. I smiled softly. No, Frank. He wouldn't have fought. He would have prepared. Frank stood there in the gravel parking lot, digesting that for a long moment, before nodding once. "I suppose you're right," he muttered. Meanwhile, Eleanor wasted absolutely no time asserting her dominance. Just 3 days later, she invited half the Harper family to a long lunch at the Old Brogue Irish pub. By dinner, her version of the story had circulated to everyone we knew. The narrative she was spinning was simple: Margaret knows she can't win, so she's finally doing the decent thing and stepping aside. After all, her son had built Harper Precision, so it belonged with his true family. It was fascinating how, after 21 years of being Daniel's wife, I suddenly no longer counted as family to them. Even distant cousins I hadn't seen in a decade suddenly felt qualified to discuss my future over the phone. One afternoon, my neighbor Linda carried over a fresh peach cobbler and placed it gently on my kitchen counter. "You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to," she said softly, squeezing my hand. "But are you okay, Margaret?" I let out a soft laugh. "No, Linda. I'm not." We stood there in the quiet kitchen without speaking. Sometimes, quiet solidarity is much kinder than well-meaning advice. A week later, Michael called to remind me that the first probate conference was scheduled for the following Tuesday. "If you're still planning to let Eleanor walk away with everything, Margaret, I need to know before we step into that courtroom," he warned. I looked out the window toward Daniel's workshop behind the house, the lights dark and his heavy metal toolbox sitting exactly where he had left it. "I haven't changed my mind, Michael." He sighed heavily through the receiver. "I hope your husband left you something more than just courage." After I hung up, I whispered to the empty kitchen, "So do I." The truth was, I wasn't nearly as certain as I let on. Every single night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering whether I was truly honoring Daniel's legacy or making the single biggest mistake of my life. By the time the crisp October air arrived, people had stopped asking me if I was going to fight. They had already decided I was a victim who had simply given up. In Fairfax, once a story was decided, it was set in stone. Whenever I picked up groceries or stopped by the CVS to grab a prescription, people would tilt their heads, give me that sad, patronizing smile, and tell me how sorry they were. I thanked them every time, knowing that none of them knew the whole story. The truth was, neither did I. On a bright Monday morning, Michael drove me down to Harper Precision Manufacturing in Alexandria. Daniel had asked me to stay involved with the business after his retirement, mostly to handle the payroll, taxes, and employee benefits while he ran the daily operations on the machine shop floor. The company wasn't glamorous. We didn't build high-tech weapons or massive tanks. We repaired and maintained precision hydraulic systems used by fire departments, search and rescue teams, municipal utility companies, and several long-term federal contractors. Daniel always said there was far more honor in fixing equipment that saved lives than making headlines. The moment we stepped through the heavy metal double doors, the familiar, comforting smell of machine oil and fresh brewed coffee wrapped around me, making me feel closer to Daniel than I had in weeks. Rick, our production manager, hurried over to us, his face pale. "Mrs. Harper, you can still call me Margaret, Rick," I corrected gently. He smiled weakly, glancing around the shop floor where several machinists had stopped pretending to work and were openly listening to us. "We've all been wondering, Margaret. Is it true? Eleanor was here saying she's taking over the company." I took a slow, deliberate breath. "The probate case is still ongoing, Rick. Are our jobs safe?" he asked, his voice tight. That question cut me deeper than any of Eleanor's greedy demands. These weren't just employees to us. Many of these men and women had been with Daniel for 20 years. Some were veterans, others were the children of men who had worked at the shop before them. Their mortgages, their children's college funds, and their retirements were tied to this building. "I honestly don't know yet, Rick," I admitted. It wasn't the reassuring answer they wanted, but it was the only honest one I could give. Later that afternoon, Rick walked me through the quiet machine shop, stopping beside a massive CNC milling machine. "You remember when the Colonel bought this?" he asked with a small grin. I smiled back. He drove all the way to Ohio himself to inspect it. Rick laughed, the tension finally breaking. He spent 6 hours arguing with the seller over $1,500. He loved a good negotiation. He wasn't cheap, I reminded him. He just refused to waste a single dime. For the first time in weeks, a real, genuine laugh escaped my chest, surprising both of us. But the warmth of that memory vanished the second I pulled back into my driveway at home. Eleanor's expensive SUV was parked directly across the street, and she was standing on the pavement with a real estate agent, pointing toward my front porch, my driveway, and the beautiful flower beds Daniel had planted during his first summer of retirement. They were taking measurements. I pulled into the garage, closed the door, and went inside without saying a word. Within minutes, Linda knocked on my back door. "Did you see them out there?" she asked, her eyes rolling back. I did. She was literally telling the realtor she wanted to remodel your kitchen before Christmas, Margaret. I don't understand how you're not over there screaming at her. I looked through the kitchen window toward the workshop. Because that is exactly what she wants me to do. Instead of fighting her, I spent my evenings out in Daniel's workshop. I didn't go out there to cry anymore. I went out there to organize. I sat at his heavy wooden workbench and began sorting through his life, military journals, maintenance logs, business binders, tax returns, and old legal correspondence. Daniel labeled everything with strict military precision. One green binder held his service records, another contained supplier contracts dating back 15 years. I wasn't searching for anything specific, I just wanted to feel close to the life we had built. Some nights, I stayed out there past midnight, listening to the quiet hum of the old country station on the radio, sorting papers folder by folder. Sometimes I would find little handwritten reminders he had left behind: call Rick, renew insurance, order bearings, tiny, beautiful pieces of our ordinary life together. Then, on a cold Thursday evening, a sealed envelope slipped out from the back of an old green binder and fluttered onto the concrete floor. Across the front, written in Daniel's unmistakable, sharp handwriting, was my name, Margaret. My hand suddenly began to shake, and my heart hammered against my ribs. I stared at the paper for a long time, but I realized I wasn't ready to open it. Not yet. I carried the binder and the letter back inside the house, placing them safely on the dining room table. At my age, I had learned that important decisions should never be made after midnight when your mind is tired and heavy. The next morning, I poured myself coffee in Daniel's favorite navy blue mug, staring out at the front yard where our giant maple tree was dropping bright orange leaves across the driveway. Daniel used to complain endlessly about raking them, only to spend the entire afternoon doing it anyway with a quiet smile on his face. Before I could finish my coffee, Linda was knocking frantically on my door. "Margaret, you need to come outside right now," she said, her voice a mix of anger and sheer amusement. I stepped onto the porch to find Eleanor standing in my backyard with two contractors. One was holding a clipboard, while the other was using a laser tape to measure the distance to our vegetable garden. I walked across the lawn, my boots crunching on the dry leaves. "Morning, Eleanor." She barely glanced up. "Oh, Margaret." One of the contractors smiled politely at me, murmuring a quiet, "Ma'am." Eleanor pointed toward the raised vegetable beds Daniel had built with his own hands. "I'll probably have all of this removed," she said casually. "They are far too difficult to maintain. I prefer clean, open landscaping." I simply nodded, keeping my face entirely blank. "I'm sure you do." She looked almost disappointed that I hadn't put up a fight. By Friday, Linda called me to report that Eleanor had already ordered brand new living room furniture and was telling the neighbors she would be fully moved into my house before Thanksgiving. "That's incredibly ambitious of her," I murmured, holding the phone to my ear as I stirred a pot of chicken soup. "Margaret, why are you so calm?" Linda demanded. "I'm not calm, Linda. I've just stopped wasting my energy trying to control what other people do." On Saturday, Rick and two other longtime machinists from the shop showed up at my front door carrying a giant box of donuts from our favorite bakery in Centerville. We sat around my kitchen table for an hour, talking about football, rising grocery prices, and ordinary things, before Rick finally cleared his throat and looked down at his hands. "Eleanor visited the shop yesterday, Margaret." She introduced herself as the future owner, and then she asked us for a list of all employees over the age of 60. She said younger workers are cheaper. The kitchen fell into a painful, heavy silence. Carl, one of our oldest machinists, folded his hands tightly. "Colonel Harper would have never treated us like that, Margaret." "No, Carl," I said softly. "He wouldn't." Carl reached over and patted my hand. "We don't care who legally owns the company, Margaret. We care who leads it." After they left, I sat alone in the kitchen, their words ringing in my ears. Leadership. That was Daniel's favorite word. Not authority, not power, leadership. I walked over to the dining room table, picked up the sealed envelope, and finally broke the seal. Inside were 3 full pages of Daniel's handwriting. The very first sentence made my chest tighten. "My darling Margaret, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. And knowing my mother, she's probably already making your life harder than it needs to be." I let out a tearful laugh. Even in death, he knew her perfectly. As I read on, he talked about ordinary things, reminding me to change the furnace filters and telling me not to let anyone talk me into selling his old pickup truck because it still had 100,000 miles left in it. Then, his writing turned serious. "You know me well enough to know that I never walked into a military operation without a prepared exit plan. Business is no different. Michael knows where the important papers are. If something ever feels wrong, ask him to check the blue estate binder, not the green one." I ran back out to the workshop, searching the bottom shelf of his bookcase beneath several heavy boxes of tax records. There it was, a blue 3-ring binder covered in a thin layer of dust. I opened it to find trust documents, corporate records, and legal correspondence dating back nearly 8 years. On one page, a yellow sticky note was attached in Daniel's handwriting. "Michael, review every 5 years." I immediately dialed Michael's number, my voice trembling. "Michael, I found something. You need to come over." 20 minutes later, Michael was sitting at my dining room table, his reading glasses perched on his nose as he carefully turned the pages of the blue binder. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked loudly as 5 minutes passed, then 10. Michael's expression shifted from confusion to curiosity, and finally to absolute disbelief. He took off his glasses, looking at me with a quiet awe. Margaret. Daniel didn't hide anything. He documented everything exactly the way he was supposed to. If these records are valid, Harper Precision and your home do not belong to Daniel's probate estate. I blinked, trying to process the words. So, Eleanor has spent the last month fighting over property that isn't even part of the estate? Michael gave a slow, deliberate nod. If these are legitimate, and they certainly appear to be, the final hearing next week is going to unfold very differently than anyone expects. The morning of the final probate hearing arrived, cold and gray. I sat at my kitchen table at 6:30 a.m., staring at a plate of scrambled eggs I couldn't eat. Michael had called me the night before to confirm that every single document in the blue binder was entirely legally binding, but he had refused to give me more details, chuckling that he had learned his theatrical timing from my husband. When I arrived at the Fairfax County Courthouse, the hallway outside Probate Courtroom 3 was packed. Neighbors from our street, veterans from Daniel's American Legion post, and almost the entire workforce of Harper Precision had taken the morning off to stand by me. Linda hugged me tightly. You look calm, Margaret. I've had a lot of practice lately, I replied. Inside the courtroom, Eleanor looked like she was attending a victory banquet. She wore a cream-colored designer suit, her signature pearls, and a triumphant smile. When she saw me, she walked over with an air of mock sympathy. I hope there are no hard feelings, Margaret. I looked at her calmly. There should have been fewer hard words, Eleanor. Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second. This is simply business. No, I said, shaking my head. It stopped being business the day we buried your son. Judge Helen Whitaker entered the courtroom, and the proceedings began. Eleanor's attorney, Charles Benton, gave a polished, confident presentation about family bloodlines, legacy, and generational ownership. When he finished, Michael stood up. His opening statement lasted less than 2 minutes. We have no objection to the petition as it relates to assets legally belonging to the probate estate. Charles smiled, thinking we had fully surrendered. One by one, documents were passed down to me to sign, relinquishing my claims to the estate. I signed each one, the scratch of my pen echoing in the quiet room. From the corner of my eye, I saw Eleanor lean back comfortably, completely convinced she had won. When I signed the final page, a murmur ran through the gallery of onlookers. Someone whispered, she gave up, while another voiced disbelief. Charles closed his briefcase with a satisfying click, and Eleanor flashed me a cold, victorious smile. Judge Whitaker gathered the signed documents into a folder, reading them silently. The silence stretched on for a full minute. Then, instead of issuing her ruling, she slowly closed the file, took off her reading glasses, and looked directly at Charles Benton. Counselor, before this court enters a final order, I need clarification. Did you verify whether every asset listed in your petition is actually part of Colonel Harper's probate estate? Charles stood up confidently. Yes, Your Honor. Judge Whitaker opened a smaller folder sitting beneath her desk. Are you certain? Charles hesitated, looking back at Eleanor, who gave him an encouraging nod. Yes, Your Honor. Interesting, Judge Whitaker murmured, turning a page. Mr. Benton, were you aware that Harper Precision Manufacturing was transferred into the Harper Legacy Trust over 7 years ago? Charles blinked, his confidence vanishing instantly. I'm sorry, Your Honor? The Harper Legacy Trust, the judge repeated. Silence blanketed the room. Charles frantically began flipping through his binders, his hands shaking as his movements became rushed and disorganized. Eleanor leaned forward, grabbing his arm. What is she talking about? She hissed. And were you also aware, Judge Whitaker continued, that the residence on Willow Creek Drive was conveyed into that very same trust during that transaction? My heart was pounding so loudly I was certain the entire room could hear it. Charles looked completely lost. Your Honor, those documents were never presented during discovery. Michael stood up calmly. They were recorded with Fairfax County in 2018, Your Honor. The certified copy and recording information are attached to the final page of our filing. The court clerk passed the papers to the judge, who compared them and nodded. They match. A wave of whispers washed over the gallery. Rick looked at me with wide eyes, Linda covered her mouth in shock, and even Frank Donovan let out a low whistle of surprise. Eleanor gripped Charles's sleeve tightly. What is this? You said everything was part of the estate. Charles swallowed hard. That is what the preliminary search indicated. Michael remained standing, his voice steady. The petition relied on outdated county ownership records. They failed to check the trust filings. Judge Whitaker looked sternly at Charles. Counselor, did you independently verify the title before asking this court to distribute these assets? Charles looked down at his table. I relied on the information provided by my client. I see, the judge said, making a quick note in her file before looking at Eleanor. Mrs. Harper, this court cannot distribute property that is not legally owned by the estate. Eleanor's triumphant smile disappeared entirely, replaced by a look of sheer terror. For the first time since Daniel's death, she looked completely powerless. I didn't feel victorious, I just felt incredibly tired. The weeks of cruel gossip, the sleepless nights, the fear of losing my home, none of it could be erased by a single moment in a courtroom. But I remembered what Daniel had told me years ago while we were painting our front porch. Truth doesn't always arrive first, Margaret. Sometimes it takes the long road. The truth had finally arrived. Judge Whitaker turned back to Michael. Mr. Ross, please explain the terms of the Harper Legacy Trust for the record. Michael picked up the blue binder. Colonel Daniel Harper established this trust in June of 2018. The trust became the legal owner of Harper Precision Manufacturing, and it lists 3 co-trustees, Margaret Harper, Richard Coleman, our production manager, and the Veterans Community Foundation of Northern Virginia. Rick nearly fell out of his chair at the mention of his name, whispering, "Me?" In total shock. I nodded back at him with a smile. Daniel had protected him, too. The trust requires unanimous approval from all 3 trustees before the business can be sold, dissolved, or relocated, Michael continued. So, no one can simply sell the company? Judge Whitaker asked, looking impressed. No one, Your Honor, Michael answered. The trust stipulates that the company must continue operating in Northern Virginia, it must maintain its veteran hiring program, and no fewer than 80% of its full-time employees must be retained during any transition of leadership. Carl let out a massive sigh of relief in the back row, and several people laughed happily. So, Judge Whitaker noted, Colonel Harper intended to protect both his business and the dedicated people who run it. Exactly, Your Honor. Eleanor was trembling now, leaning toward her lawyer. There has to be something we can do, Charles. He wouldn't cut me out. Michael's voice remained incredibly respectful as he addressed her. He didn't cut you out, Eleanor. The trust actually provides you with a one-time distribution of $50,000. And Colonel Harper wrote a personal letter to explain why. He passed the letter to the clerk, who handed it to the judge. Judge Whitaker read the letter in complete silence, her face softening as she finished. She folded the letter carefully and looked out at the courtroom. I will not read this letter aloud. It was clearly intended as a private family message. But I will say this, Colonel Harper devoted considerable thought to ensuring his family, his employees, and his community were all cared for after his death. The silence in the courtroom felt entirely different now, it was peaceful and purposeful. The judge signed the final orders and closed the thick case file. The claims seeking ownership of Harper Precision Manufacturing and the residents on Willow Creek Drive are hereby denied. These assets are not part of the probate estate. Her gavel struck once, and the sound echoed like a bell of freedom. For the first time in months, I felt like I could finally breathe. When the hearing ended, nobody rushed for the doors. Eleanor remained frozen in her seat, staring blankly at the table, while Charles Benton quietly packed his files in silence. Michael gathered our documents and looked over at me with a smile. You all right, Margaret? I think so, I said, smiling back. It just feels incredibly strange to finally lay this weight down. Outside the courthouse, the autumn air felt crisp and clean. A small group of local reporters had gathered near the steps, recognizing Eleanor as she walked out. "Mrs. Harper, do you have a comment on today's ruling?" one asked. Eleanor opened her mouth, but for the first time in her life, she had absolutely nothing to say. The reporters quickly turned their microphones toward me. "Mrs. Harper, many expected a long, bitter legal battle today. How do you feel about the outcome?" I looked across the concrete plaza where Rick, Carl, Melissa from accounting, and Tom from shipping were all waiting for me. "I feel relieved," I said honestly. "And I think my husband would be very happy." "And your mother-in-law?" the reporter pressed. I looked back toward the courthouse doors. "I truly hope she finds peace." Rick caught up with me near the parking garage, still looking stunned. "I still can't believe the colonel made me a trustee, Margaret. You know what the first thing the guys asked me was? If they were keeping their jobs. I got to tell them yes." He paused, his eyes turning watery. "Thank you for never treating us like we were just employees." "Daniel taught me that, Rick," I said, my throat tightening. "No," Rick shook his head. "He showed you. You chose to live it." On Monday, I visited the shop for the first time since the hearing. The entire atmosphere had shifted. The machines hummed with a lively energy, forklifts zipped across the floor, and someone had brought in fresh donuts and a fresh pot of coffee. Carl walked over, handing me a small cardboard box we had found in Daniel's office. Inside were dozens of handwritten thank you notes Daniel had written to his employees over the years, birthday cards, retirement wishes, and notes of appreciation for staying late during storms. At the bottom of the box was an unmailed envelope addressed simply, "To whoever leads this company after me." Rick and I opened it together. It contained a single, powerful sentence: "Take care of the people, and the business will take care of itself." We both laughed, the sound healing a piece of the grief we carried. "Nobody ever did win an argument with the colonel," Rick chuckled. Winter arrived quietly that year, dropping the last of the maple leaves and bringing a sharp, clean chill to the Fairfax mornings. Life didn't instantly become perfect, real life never does. There were still tax forms to file, accountant meetings to attend, and endless trust paperwork to sign. But every Tuesday, Rick and I met in Daniel's old office to run the business. I realized I wasn't trying to replace him, I was simply protecting the legacy he had built. We updated the break room, and by spring, we welcomed our first 3 veteran apprentices, one from Afghanistan, one from the Navy, and a young Army mechanic. Watching them work on the shop floor felt like watching Daniel's spirit live on. A few weeks before Memorial Day, I received an unexpected letter from Eleanor. I stared at her handwriting on the envelope for 10 minutes before opening it. Inside was a single, short note: "Margaret, I spent so much time trying to hold on to what Daniel owned that I forgot to appreciate who he was. I cannot change what happened, but I am truly sorry for the pain I caused you." There was no request for forgiveness, just that simple admission. I folded the paper and placed it inside the blue binder. Some apologies don't erase the past, but they can stop bitterness from following you into the future. On Memorial Day morning, I walked through the quiet, endless rows of white marble headstones at Arlington National Cemetery, carrying a bunch of fresh white roses. I found Daniel's grave without needing a map. I knelt down, brushed a few stray leaves from the base of his stone, and set the flowers down. "I finally understand, Daniel," I whispered into the gentle breeze moving through the trees. "You weren't trying to protect the money. You were protecting the people." The house was never just wood and brick, the company was never just machines and contracts. They were the places where lives had been built, friendships had grown, and families had found safety. His greatest legacy wasn't measured in a bank account. It was measured in the people who were still standing because he cared enough to plan ahead. As I walked back to my car under the warm spring sun, I realized the anger was entirely gone. Justice had done its work, and what remained was a deep, lasting peace. And after everything, peace felt like the greatest inheritance of all.